The morning of November 15th, 1943, found Coxswain Lysander Kittredge crouched behind the wheel of his Higgins boat as machine gun fire raked the water around him. The smell of diesel fuel and cordite filled his nostrils as he counted the seconds between enemy bursts, calculating the impossible mathematics of survival. 43 Marines huddled in the steel belly of his landing craft vehicle personnel, their faces grim with the knowledge that standard doctrine called for immediate retreat when encountering this level of resistance. But Lysander's calloused hands remained steady on the controls, his mind racing through modifications he had made to his boat against direct orders from his commanding officer. The engine beneath him hummed with unauthorized power, and the reinforced bowplate he had welded in secret 3 weeks earlier gleamed with salt spray and determination. As another volley of bullets sparked off the water mere inches from his starboard side, Lysander made a decision that would not only save every man aboard his craft, but fundamentally change how both American and Japanese forces viewed amphibious warfare. He pushed the throttle forward into territory no regulation had ever contemplated, knowing that in the next 30 seconds he would either validate his months of clandestine engineering or send 43 good men to their deaths. The roar of his modified engine cut through the chaos of battle like a declaration of war against conventional wisdom itself. No one in the 3rd Marine Division knew that one man's defiance that morning would rewrite the tactical manual for beach assaults and earn the grudging respect of the very enemy forces trying to kill him. Lysander Kittredge had arrived at Marine Corps training in Paris Island, carrying nothing but a worn leather toolbox and a reputation for fixing things that other men considered permanently broken. Born in the shipbuilding town of Bath, Maine, he had spent his childhood in his father's boatyard, where vessels were crafted with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that separated the living from the drowned. His hands had known the feel of pine planking and oak ribs before they understood the weight of a rifle, and his understanding of how water moved around a hull was as intuitive as breathing. When the call for volunteers reached Maine in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Lysander had walked directly from his job at Bath Iron Works to the recruitment station, driven by a quiet fury that had little to do with patriotic speeches and everything to do with the practical understanding that someone needed to build the tools that would carry American boys safely across hostile waters. His drill instructors quickly recognized that beneath his soft-spoken demeanor lay the kind of mechanical genius that could strip an engine blindfolded and rebuild it better than factory specifications. During amphibious training exercises, other Marines noticed that boats under Lysander's care seemed to run smoother, turn sharper, and somehow find their way through surf that confounded less experienced coxswains. His reputation spread through the ranks with the quiet efficiency of smoke, and by the time his unit shipped out to the Pacific, senior non-commissioned officers had begun specifically requesting him for the most challenging landing operations. But what truly set Lysander apart was his habit of studying captured Japanese equipment with the focused intensity of a scholar, always searching for innovations that American forces might adopt or counter. His fellow Marines thought he was simply thorough, but Lysander understood that victory often belonged to whoever learned fastest from their enemy's advantages. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The broader strategic picture in the Central Pacific during late 1943 painted a sobering portrait of American ambitions colliding with Japanese defensive expertise. Operation Galvanic, the assault on the Gilbert Islands, represented the first major test of American amphibious doctrine against heavily fortified positions that Japanese forces had spent months preparing with lethal precision. The statistics alone revealed the magnitude of the challenge facing American planners. Tarawa Atoll contained approximately 4,700 Japanese defenders who had transformed 24 square miles of coral into an interconnected fortress system featuring concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and beach obstacles designed specifically to destroy landing craft at their most vulnerable moment. American intelligence estimates indicated that the assault would require overwhelming the defenders through sheer numbers and firepower, but the reality of coral reef geography meant that traditional naval bombardment could only accomplish limited objectives. The Higgins boats, officially designated landing craft vehicle personnel, had proven their worth in previous operations. But the unique challenges of Pacific atolls demanded innovations that existing doctrine had not anticipated. Each LCVP measured 36 feet in length and could theoretically carry 36 fully equipped troops or a small vehicle. But their shallow draft of just 3 feet forward and 4 feet aft meant they could deliver soldiers directly onto beaches that larger vessels could never approach. Japanese military planners had studied American amphibious capabilities extensively and concluded that the Higgins boat represented the single most dangerous element of American offensive power, capable of turning any coastline into a potential invasion point. Their defensive preparations specifically targeted these craft during the critical moments when they transitioned from deep-water maneuverability to beach assault configuration. What Japanese commanders did not anticipate was the possibility that individual American coxswains might modify their boats beyond standard specifications, creating capabilities that no tactical manual had ever described. The mathematics of the coming battle suggested that conventional approaches would result in catastrophic casualties, but mathematics had never accounted for the kind of mechanical improvisation that American ingenuity could produce under pressure. The first hint that November 15th would demand something beyond standard procedure came at 0400 hours when Lysander received his mission briefing in the cramped wardroom of the transport ship USS Cambria. Lieutenant Colonel Montague Ashworth, a career Marine whose facial scars told the story of previous beach assaults, spread reconnaissance photographs across the metal table with the careful precision of a man who understood that every detail could mean the difference between success and slaughter. The photographs revealed a stretch of beach designated Red Beach 2, where Japanese defenders had concentrated their most sophisticated obstacles, in a pattern that seemed almost mathematically designed to funnel American landing craft into killing zones. Ashworth's finger traced the approach routes while his voice remained steady and professional, but Lysander could see the concern in his commanding officer's eyes. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese forces had positioned at least 12 heavy machine guns in concrete emplacements, specifically angled to rake the shallow water where Higgins boats would be most vulnerable, and underwater obstacles extended nearly 200 yards from the high tide mark. The tactical situation demanded that Lysander's boat, along with 11 others in the first wave, deliver their human cargo directly into this maelstrom of prepared defensive fire, while maintaining enough operational capability to return for subsequent waves. Standard doctrine called for a coordinated approach at maximum speed, hoping that overwhelming numbers and covering fire from destroyers would suppress enough enemy resistance to establish a foothold. But as Lysander studied the photographs more carefully, his mechanical mind began calculating modifications that might give his boat and its passengers a fighting chance against odds that seemed to favor the defenders overwhelmingly. The steel hull of the Cambria vibrated with the distant rumble of naval gunfire as the preliminary bombardment commenced, and somewhere in that rhythmic thunder, Lysander heard the echo of his father's voice reminding him that boats were meant to bring people home safely, not deliver them to their deaths. He thought about the 43 Marines who would trust their lives to his seamanship in less than 6 hours, and the weight of that responsibility settled over him like the Maine fog he remembered from his childhood. What happened next would either validate months of unauthorized modifications or expose him as a fool who had gambled with other men's lives, and then the lights went out as the ship moved to darkened ship conditions, leaving only the sound of waves against steel and the knowledge that dawn would bring either triumph or catastrophe. As the first pale light of November 15th began to illuminate the hostile waters around Tarawa, Lysander made his final adjustments to the modifications he had spent weeks concealing from his superiors. Working by touch in the pre-dawn darkness, his hands moved with the confident precision of a craftsman who understood exactly how each alteration would affect his boat's performance under combat conditions. The most significant change involved a steel plate he had welded to the bow, angled at precisely 15 degrees to deflect small arms fire while providing additional protection for the Marines crowded behind it. This modification violated at least 3 different regulations regarding unauthorized alterations to military equipment, but Lysander had calculated that the added weight would actually improve his boat's stability in rough water while creating a psychological advantage for troops who could advance with greater confidence. His second innovation involved bypassing the engine's factory governor to access nearly 30% more horsepower than regulations permitted, a modification that required careful attention to fuel mixture and cooling, but could provide crucial extra speed during the most dangerous moments of a beach assault. The third change was perhaps the most audacious. Lysander had reinforced the boat's sides with salvaged steel plating from a damaged destroyer, creating protection that would stop rifle bullets and most shrapnel while maintaining the shallow draft that made Higgins' boats so effective. These modifications had required him to work in secret during off-duty hours, using tools borrowed from the ship's machine shop and materials acquired through the informal trading network that existed among enlisted men who understood that regulations sometimes conflicted with survival. His boat now weighed nearly 800 pounds more than factory specifications and carried enough unauthorized equipment to result in a court-martial if discovered. But Lysander's calculations suggested that these changes would give his passengers the best possible chance of reaching the beach alive. As he performed his final equipment checks, he could hear the voices of the Marines who would depend on his seamanship in less than 2 hours, and their quiet conversations about home and family reminded him exactly why he had chosen to risk his career on mechanical innovations that no manual had ever contemplated. The naval bombardment continued to thunder in the distance, but Lysander knew that once his boat entered the shallow water near the beach, he and his passengers would face the enemy alone. The moment of truth arrived at 0730 hours when the signal flags went up and the first wave of Higgins boats began their approach toward the reef that surrounded Tarawa like a natural fortress. Lysander's modified engine responded to his touch with a throaty growl that seemed to communicate its readiness for the trial ahead, and the 43 Marines crouched behind his reinforced sides checked their equipment with the methodical precision of men who understood that preparation was their only ally against chaos. The water around them churned with the wakes of other landing craft as the formation moved toward shore, but Lysander's attention focused entirely on the tactical problem immediately ahead: how to deliver his human cargo through a gauntlet of defensive fire that Japanese planners had spent months perfecting. The first indication that his modifications might prove decisive came when small arms fire began to pepper the water around his boat, at a range where standard doctrine called for evasive maneuvers that would slow their approach and extend their exposure to enemy fire. But the steel plating Lysander had installed deflected the initial bursts with metallic sparks that seemed to inspire rather than intimidate the Marines behind him, and his unauthorized engine modifications allowed him to maintain attack speed, despite the increasing intensity of defensive fire. As his boat approached the critical transition point where shallow water would force him to reduce speed, Lysander made a decision that contradicted every regulation he had ever learned about landing craft operations. Instead of following the prescribed approach route that enemy gunners had obviously anticipated, he angled his boat toward a section of reef that appeared to offer better cover, but violated explicit orders about maintaining formation integrity. His modified bow plate cut through the coral-laden water with authority, while his reinforced sides absorbed hits that would have penetrated standard armor. And suddenly the Marines aboard his craft realized they were experiencing something unprecedented in amphibious warfare. The enemy fire that had seemed overwhelming just moments before now struck their boat with the frustrated ineffectiveness of rain against a steel roof, and Lysander's unauthorized speed allowed him to reach the beach nearly 40 seconds ahead of the other boats in his wave. As his landing ramp dropped onto Tarawa's coral sand, the Marines charged forward with the confidence of soldiers who had just witnessed proof that American ingenuity could overcome Japanese preparation. The immediate aftermath of Lysander's successful landing created a tactical situation that neither American nor Japanese commanders had anticipated according to their respective operational plans. His 43 Marines established a beachhead with such speed and effectiveness that adjacent enemy positions found themselves under flanking fire before they could adjust their defensive arrangements, and the psychological impact of his boat's apparent invulnerability began to ripple through both military forces with consequences that transcended the immediate tactical situation. Japanese observers, trained to expect American landing craft to suffer heavy casualties during the approach phase, found themselves witnessing a demonstration of mechanical innovation that challenged their fundamental assumptions about amphibious warfare capabilities. Radio intercepts later revealed that Japanese officers reported American forces had deployed some type of new armored landing craft that seemed immune to standard defensive measures, and this intelligence sparked immediate discussions about the need to revise defensive tactics throughout the Pacific theater. Meanwhile, other American coxswains in the first wave began reporting requests from their Marine passengers to emulate whatever Lysander had done to his boat, creating an informal demand for modifications that would eventually reach the attention of senior commanders who initially responded with disciplinary threats before recognizing the tactical advantages Lysander had achieved. The success of his unauthorized landing inspired a series of impromptu modifications among other boat crews who began experimenting with armor plating, engine modifications, and tactical approaches that had never appeared in any official manual. By midday, even Japanese radio communications acknowledged that American landing craft seemed to have evolved beyond their previous capabilities, with one intercepted message specifically noting that the boats appeared to have become more dangerous than some American destroyers. The transformation was remarkable. A single Marine's mechanical innovations had begun to reshape the tactical calculations of both sides in ways that would influence amphibious operations for the remainder of the war. What neither side fully understood at the time was that Lysander's modifications represented just the beginning of a broader evolution in landing craft design and employment that would eventually make the Higgins boat the most feared American weapon in the eyes of Japanese defenders. The documentation of Lysander's tactical success began almost immediately as Marine Corps photographers and intelligence officers recognized they were witnessing something historically significant that demanded careful analysis and preservation. Within hours of his landing, technical teams were measuring the modifications to his boat, while combat correspondents interviewed the Marines who had experienced what they unanimously described as the most effective beach assault of their military careers. The statistical evidence supported their testimonies with mathematical precision. Lysander's boat had suffered 0 casualties during its approach and landing, while other craft in the same wave had experienced an average casualty rate of nearly 30%. His unauthorized armor modifications had deflected or absorbed over 200 individual hits from small arms fire and shrapnel, and his engine modifications had reduced his exposure time to defensive fire by nearly 45 seconds compared to standard approach speeds. More significantly, The tactical advantage gained by his early landing had allowed his Marines to establish positions that contributed to the capture of 3 enemy strongpoints and the neutralization of 2 machine gun nests that had been inflicting casualties on other landing teams. The ripple effects of his tactical success extended far beyond his immediate area of operations as other Marine units began requesting similar modifications to their boats, creating an informal innovation movement that would eventually reach the highest levels of military command. Intelligence analysts noted that Japanese radio traffic had begun referring to American landing craft using terminology that suggested both respect and concern, with one intercepted communication describing the boats as demonstrating innovations that Japanese forces had not anticipated. The transformation in Japanese perception was particularly significant because their military culture traditionally viewed American technology as inferior to Japanese engineering, but the effectiveness of Lysander's modifications had forced a fundamental reassessment of American innovative capabilities. By the end of November 15th, Marine Corps engineers were already drafting technical specifications based on Lysander's unauthorized alterations, and procurement officers were calculating the resources required to implement similar modifications across the entire Pacific Fleet. The boat that had begun the day as evidence of one Marine's mechanical ingenuity had become the prototype for a new generation of landing craft that would prove decisive in subsequent amphibious operations. The long-term consequences of Lysander's November morning defiance extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation as his innovations began to influence American amphibious doctrine and Japanese defensive planning throughout the Pacific theater. Within 6 weeks of the Tarawa operation, Marine Corps technical teams had reverse-engineered his modifications and begun implementing standardized versions across the entire landing craft fleet, transforming what had been unauthorized experimentation into official equipment upgrades that would save thousands of American lives in subsequent operations. The armor plating system he had improvised became the foundation for factory-produced reinforcement packages that provided protection equivalent to light armored vehicles, while maintaining the shallow draft characteristics that made Higgins boats uniquely effective. His engine modifications inspired a complete overhaul of power plant specifications that increased standard performance by nearly 25%, and his tactical innovations regarding approach routes and formation integrity became required instruction at amphibious warfare schools. Japanese military intelligence, meanwhile, had begun developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize the enhanced capabilities that American landing craft had demonstrated. But their defensive preparations consistently lagged behind the pace of American innovation that Lysander's example had inspired. The psychological impact proved equally significant as Marine morale throughout the Pacific improved dramatically once word spread that American ingenuity had found effective answers to Japanese defensive advantages. Lysander himself was quietly promoted to sergeant and assigned to a technical advisory role that allowed him to continue developing modifications while training other coxswains in the tactical employment of enhanced landing craft. His unauthorized innovations had become so valuable that the military bureaucracy retroactively authorized all of his modifications and began actively encouraging similar experimentation among experienced boat crews who understood local operational conditions. The transformation was complete. What had begun as one Marine's violation of regulations had become the foundation for tactical superiority that would prove decisive in operations ranging from the Marshall Islands to the Philippines. Japanese post-war military analyses would later acknowledge that American landing craft innovations had forced fundamental changes in defensive planning that consumed resources and strategic attention disproportionate to the actual size and cost of the modifications involved. In the decades following the war, Lysander returned to Bath, Maine, where he resumed his career building boats with the same meticulous attention to detail that had saved 43 lives on a November morning in 1943. He married a local teacher named Cordelia Whitmore and raised 3 children who grew up hearing stories about their father's mechanical innovations, but never fully understanding the historical significance of his wartime modifications until they were adults. The boatyard where he worked became something of a pilgrimage site for Marine veterans who would travel from across the country to shake hands with the man whose ingenuity had proven that American practical intelligence could overcome any defensive system that hostile forces might devise. Letters arrived regularly from Marines who credited their survival to the innovations that had transformed standard landing craft into tactical weapons that commanded respect even from enemy forces. Japanese veterans, when they learned of Lysander's role in developing the modifications that had so frustrated their defensive efforts, expressed a complicated admiration for the mechanical genius that had turned routine equipment into implements of tactical revolution. Marine Corps historians documented his contributions with the thoroughness that significant innovations deserve, and his unauthorized modifications became case studies in military engineering schools where students learned that battlefield effectiveness sometimes required violating regulations in service of larger tactical objectives. The Higgins boat itself evolved into one of the most celebrated American weapons of the war, but those who understood its history recognized that much of its legendary effectiveness traced directly to the unauthorized modifications that one Marine had developed in violation of explicit orders from his superiors. Lysander never spoke publicly about his wartime innovations, preferring to let his post-war boats demonstrate the same attention to detail and practical intelligence that had made him quietly famous among those who valued results over regulations. His workshop remained active until his retirement in 1978, and visitors often noted that he continued building boats as if every vessel might someday carry someone's life in its hands. The broader historical legacy of Lysander's innovation demonstrates how individual initiative could reshape military doctrine when practical intelligence confronted bureaucratic limitations that threatened lives and mission success. His story illustrates the eternal tension between following orders and achieving objectives, revealing how the most significant tactical advances often emerge from unauthorized experimentation by personnel who understand operational realities better than distant headquarters staff. The fact that Japanese forces came to respect and fear American landing craft more than vessels many times their size reflects the psychological impact that effective innovation could have on enemy morale and strategic planning. Modern amphibious doctrine still incorporates principles that trace directly to the modifications Lysander developed during his secret workshop sessions aboard the USS Cambria, proving that battlefield innovations often possess a longevity that outlasts the conflicts that inspired them. Military historians recognize his contributions as representative of a broader pattern in which American tactical success depended on encouraging individual initiative rather than demanding rigid adherence to regulations that field conditions had rendered obsolete. The transformation of the Higgins boat from standard equipment into a weapon that enemy forces specifically feared demonstrates how mechanical innovation could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to the resources invested in development and implementation. Lysander's willingness to risk court-martial in service of tactical effectiveness exemplifies the kind of moral courage that democratic societies require from their military personnel when conventional approaches prove inadequate to protect the lives entrusted to their care. His story reminds us that victory often belongs to those who understand that regulations exist to serve objectives rather than substitute for them, and that individual responsibility sometimes demands actions that violate orders but serve larger purposes that those orders were intended to achieve. The respect that Japanese Marines eventually expressed for American landing craft represents a professional acknowledgement that tactical innovation had fundamentally altered the balance of amphibious warfare in ways that formal military hierarchy had neither anticipated nor initially approved. Would you have broken the order and risked everything to save the lives of 43 men who trusted your judgment more than military regulations? Comment below and share this story, so others remember that sometimes the greatest victories come from those who dare to innovate when following orders means accepting defeat. The courage to think beyond the manual when lives hang in the balance represents the kind of individual initiative that democratic societies must cherish and protect, because freedom ultimately depends on citizens who understand that doing what is right sometimes requires doing what is unauthorized.